Wealth, influence, and reputation collapsed in an instant when a father realized nothing could silence his baby's cries. Just when the tension seemed unbearable, an answer appeared from the last place anyone expected, setting off a chain of events that reached far beyond the flight itself. The twist that followed redefined what it means to be truly powerful. Like this video, subscribe for more stories, and drop a comment about where you're watching and how this story struck you. Billionaire Edward Langston, CEO of a powerful tech corporation, boarded a transatlantic flight with his 6-month-old daughter Isabella, unaware that the most important figure on this journey would not be him but a black teenager seated far back in economy class. Edward's wife had just undergone emergency surgery, leaving him no choice but to bring their infant along while still attending critical meetings in London that could shape the future of his company. At first, things seemed manageable. Isabella rested peacefully in her bassinet as Edward reviewed notes and sipped water, convincing himself his wife was right when she insisted, "It's just 5 days, you'll manage." But the illusion shattered when Isabella stirred awake. Her whimper grew into a piercing cry, then into full-throated wails that rattled the cabin. Edward tried feeding her, but she refused the bottle. He changed her diaper awkwardly in the cramped restroom, returning sweaty and flustered, only to find her screams intensifying. He attempted to rock her in his arms the way he had seen his wife do, but nothing soothed her. The more he tried, the worse her crying became. For 3 relentless hours, the sound filled every corner of first class. Flight attendants offered suggestions: white noise, softer lights, even a tiny speaker with ocean sounds, but nothing worked. They smiled professionally, but their eyes betrayed concern for the growing tension. The passengers, however, were less discreet. Charles Morton, a wealthy investor in seat 1 Ampere, groaned loudly and checked his watch as if counting the seconds of his torture. He muttered to his wife, "This is exactly why children shouldn't be allowed up here." 2 rows back, socialite Vivian Blake clacked furiously on her phone, clearly messaging complaints to her circle. "Some people have no consideration," she said to her assistant, making no effort to lower her voice. Every glance toward Edward was a dagger, each sigh or rolled eye another reminder of his failure. Normally, Edward would have dismissed the opinions of others. As a billionaire, he was accustomed to envy, criticism, and scrutiny. But this was different. His pride wasn't under attack. His ability to be a father was. He had built an empire, yet here he was unable to quiet his daughter's cries. The shame was unbearable. Even the pilot seemed to twist the knife when he made a calm announcement about ensuring a comfortable journey for all passengers. Edward knew who that message was aimed at. Isabella's tiny face was red, her fists clenched, her body shaking with every shriek. Each scream carried more than discomfort. It was a message Edward couldn't decipher, and that broke him. He whispered reassurances she couldn't understand, sang lullabies in a hoarse voice, and pressed his headphones to her ears to play classical music, but nothing helped. He felt his confidence, unshakable in boardrooms and negotiations, crumble beneath the helpless cries of a baby. As the hours dragged on, Edward wasn't just worried about the flight. He was terrified of what awaited him in London. 5 days of critical negotiations with Isabella, still this uncontrollable, seemed impossible. If she disrupted his meetings the way she was disrupting the flight, his entire European expansion deal could collapse. He had hired the best nanny agency, but their chosen caregiver had canceled last minute, leaving him stranded in this predicament. Now, every judgmental stare from passengers cut him deeper. The man who thrived under pressure now sat powerless, his empire meaningless in the face of one child's tears. But what Edward didn't know was that 3 rows behind the curtain dividing economy and first class, a 16-year-old black teenager named Malik Johnson had been listening carefully. Malik came from Chicago's South Side, raised by his mother and grandmother in a cramped apartment with 3 younger siblings. He was on his way to London to compete in the international mathematics competition, carrying only a patched backpack, worn clothes, and the hopes of an entire community that had scraped together donations to buy his ticket. Malik's younger sister had suffered from severe colic as an infant, crying for hours just like Isabella. Out of love and desperation, he had spent months researching, experimenting, and learning gentle techniques to soothe her. Through patience and trial, he had developed a method that worked when nothing else did. His grandmother often said, That boy's got magic hands, he can calm any baby. Hearing Isabella's cries brought him right back to those nights in Chicago. Malik recognized the pattern of distress, the pitch that told him she wasn't just fussy. She was overwhelmed and trapped in discomfort. For 2 hours, he tried to focus on his math textbooks, but the sound gnawed at him. His heart battled his head. He knew walking into first class as a poor black teenager could be seen as intrusion, even a threat. People might look at him with suspicion or worse, but compassion won. Malik couldn't ignore the cries. Gathering his courage, he closed his notebook and rose from his seat. Passengers in economy watched curiously as he moved down the aisle toward first class. At the curtain, a flight attendant blocked him, eyes narrowing. "Can I help you?" she asked, ready to redirect him. Malik spoke quietly but firmly. "The baby in first class, I think I can help." The attendant looked skeptical. Edward stood in the aisle holding Isabella, her cries growing hoarse but no less piercing. And he felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him, each one a silent accusation of his incompetence. He had expected annoyance from strangers, but the open hostility was worse than he imagined. Charles Morton groaned again, this time loud enough for everyone in first class to hear, and said to his wife, "3 hours of this, and I'll demand a refund, billionaire or not." His words cut straight through Edward's pride, making him wonder if his status meant anything in this confined space where no amount of wealth could buy silence. Vivian Blake leaned forward in her seat, glaring at Edward with practiced disdain before snapping a picture of him with her phone and whispering to her assistant, "This will be trending before we land. Just wait. People love a billionaire meltdown." Edward felt his stomach twist. He could almost see the tabloids already. Edward Langston, genius in business, failure as a father. The flight attendants kept up their rehearsed professionalism, offering bottles of water, blankets, and small suggestions, but their voices carried the tone of helplessness that matched Edward's own. Isabella's face had turned scarlet, her tiny fists beating against his chest as if to protest the inadequacy of his care. He tried bouncing her gently down the aisle, tried whispering words of comfort, but her cries only escalated until they seemed to pierce through the thin walls of the aircraft itself. The cabin grew hotter. His shirt clung to his back, and sweat collected at his temples. He could hear murmurs now, not just from first class, but from passengers behind the curtain of economy. The sound of discontent was spreading, and he realized with dread that he was quickly becoming the villain of this flight. For Edward, humiliation was not a familiar emotion. He had been feared and respected in boardrooms since his 20s, and his wealth placed him above the reach of ordinary scorn. But here, on this plane, he was no more powerful than any other parent with a screaming child, and the judgment was relentless. He began to imagine what would happen if Isabella kept crying all the way across the Atlantic. He pictured furious passengers demanding refunds, social media erupting with derision, and perhaps even being met by reporters upon landing. His empire might not collapse over one flight, but the cracks in his image could begin here, in this flying prison. Meanwhile, Malik sat quietly in economy, watching the scene unfold with growing urgency. He had remained still through the first hours, torn between compassion and fear of rejection. But as Isabella's cries grew sharper, and Edward's face turned pale with despair, Malik knew he couldn't wait any longer. He glanced at his patched backpack lying on the seat, stuffed with the hopes of his neighborhood, and thought of his mother's tired hands and his grandmother's words. "Your gift is not just for numbers, Malik. Your gift is for people." He stood slowly, aware of the eyes on him now too, and began to move down the aisle. Some passengers looked confused, others suspicious, but Malik kept his gaze forward, driven by something stronger than his fear. When he reached the curtain separating economy from first class, a flight attendant intercepted him with polite firmness, asking if he needed help finding the restroom. Malik shook his head, speaking with quiet confidence. "The baby in first class, I think I know what's wrong. I've seen it before with my little sister." The attendant frowned, ready to dismiss him, but Edward's sudden appearance changed everything. Edward, disheveled and nearly broken, heard Malik's words and latched onto them like a lifeline. "You said you can help?" Edward asked, his voice trembling with desperation, his corporate composure long gone. Edward's arms trembled as he held Isabella, her cries now ragged from exhaustion but no less piercing. and he felt his resolve slipping away as every passing second seemed to stretch into an eternity of judgment and shame, until the black teenager, who had stepped forward from economy, stood facing him with an expression of quiet determination that felt completely out of place for someone so young. Malik Johnson, dressed in clean but worn clothes, and carrying nothing but the calmness of experience, spoke with a voice that was soft but steady, telling Edward he had cared for a baby sister who suffered from the same unrelenting cries, a condition the doctors had called colic, and that he had found ways to soothe her when no one else could. Edward, desperate and drained, wanted to believe him, yet the weight of doubt bore down, fueled by the skeptical eyes of first-class passengers who clearly thought trusting a teenager from economy was reckless. The flight attendant lingered nearby, her professional mask strained as she debated whether to intervene, because protocol certainly didn't account for handing an infant to a stranger in the middle of a flight. But Edward had run out of options and he knew it. His mind, normally so analytical and calculating, had been reduced to a haze of fatigue and panic. And in that haze, he made the only choice that felt possible. He offered Isabella into Malik's arms. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, as if every passenger collectively held their breath, waiting to see whether this boy could accomplish what the billionaire father could not. Malik accepted Isabella with confidence that belied his 16 years, adjusting her position with careful precision, supporting her head and torso in a way that looked both practiced and instinctive. He began to hum a low, steady tune, an old lullaby passed down through his grandmother, while applying gentle pressure along her back in rhythmic motions. The transformation was nearly instant. Isabella's shrieks softened into whimpers, then hiccuped breaths, and finally melted into quiet. Her fists unclenched, her face relaxed, and her heavy eyelids fluttered closed. The silence that followed filled the cabin more powerfully than her cries ever had. Because it wasn't just quiet, it was a miracle. The same passengers who had glared daggers at Edward now leaned forward in amazement, their expressions shifting from irritation to wonder, while even Charles Morton muttered in disbelief, "Remarkable." Vivian Blake, who had been composing scathing messages moments before, lowered her phone and whispered to her assistant that she had never seen anything like it. Flight attendants gathered discreetly at the aisle, watching with wide eyes, their skepticism replaced by astonishment. Edward stared at Malik as if he were seeing him for the first time, realizing this boy possessed a gift that defied explanation, a combination of empathy, knowledge, and skill that no amount of wealth had managed to secure. He whispered, "How did you do that?" Malik looked up, his voice calm, but tinged with humility, and said, "My baby sister had colic, sir. It took me months to figure out what worked. But I learned if you hold them this way and apply steady pressure, it helps release what's trapped inside. The song keeps them calm." Edward felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that his daughter was finally at peace, shame that he had been powerless while a teenager succeeded, and gratitude that went deeper than words. Yet beneath those emotions was something else, a dawning curiosity about this boy, who had appeared like an answer to a prayer. Edward noticed the backpack slung over Malik's shoulder, patched with duct tape and stitched with colorful emblems from mathematics competitions. He glimpsed a notebook tucked into its side pocket covered with dense equations and diagrams that spoke of a mind far beyond high school level. "Who are you?" Edward asked, the question carrying more weight than just casual curiosity. Malik met his gaze evenly, replying with maturity well beyond his age. "My name is Malik Johnson. I'm 16 years old, from South Side Chicago. I'm traveling to London for the International Mathematics Competition." The words landed with surprising force. Edward, whose life revolved around technological innovation and data-driven solutions, and felt the pieces shift in his mind as he understood that the boy holding his now sleeping daughter was not only gifted with compassion and patience, but was also a mathematical prodigy. The revelation silenced him as effectively as Isabella's cries had moments before. Passengers who had been leaning in to listen exchanged glances, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a chance encounter with a helpful stranger. This was the collision of two worlds, the billionaire accustomed to privilege, and the teenager carrying the hopes of a struggling community on his shoulders. Malik continued, speaking quietly so as not to disturb the sleeping infant, and told Edward about his family. His mother working double shifts as a nurse's aide, his grandmother caring for his younger siblings, his community raising money through bake sales and car washes, to send him overseas for this one opportunity that could change his future. He explained that winning at the competition would mean a scholarship to MIT, a dream that could lift not only him but also his entire family and neighborhood. As Edward listened, he felt something inside him shift. He realized the boy before him wasn't defined by patched clothes or an economy ticket. He was defined by resilience, intellect, and character. In that moment, Edward knew he had underestimated not just Malik but people like him, those whom society too easily dismissed. Isabella stirred slightly in Malik's arms, and he adjusted her with the ease of someone who had done it countless times before. She settled again into peaceful sleep, her tiny hand curling around the edge of Malik's shirt, as though claiming him as her protector. The sight struck Edward deeply. He felt a profound gratitude, not only because Malik had soothed his daughter, but because he had restored something Edward had been losing faith that help could come from unexpected places. Edward sat frozen in his seat, unable to process the transformation that had just taken place, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible silence of the cabin with the chaos that had consumed the previous 3 hours, and his eyes remained locked on Malik Johnson, who held Isabella with practiced ease, as though he had been born to soothe her cries. The entire atmosphere of the plane had shifted in an instant, from judgment and hostility to reverence and awe, and every passenger in first class seemed to be holding their breath, as if afraid the smallest sound might undo the miracle that had occurred. Malik's humming was steady, low, and strangely hypnotic, a lullaby that carried weight far older than his years, and Edward recognized it was not something learned from books or training but from lived experience. From nights in a small Chicago apartment where love and necessity forced a teenager to learn what even adults could not master. Isabella's tiny hand clutched Malik's shirt as though anchoring herself to his calm, her breathing steady, her body no longer rigid with discomfort, and for the first time since takeoff, her face softened into a serenity that Edward had feared he might never see again on this flight. A hush had fallen over the cabin. The kind of hush that only comes after a storm when people realize they have witnessed something extraordinary, and Edward knew this was no ordinary moment. It was a revelation. Charles Morton, who had earlier demanded refunds and complained about children, leaned closer to his wife with astonishment written on his face and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "It's remarkable. Absolutely remarkable." And for once his words carried no trace of condescension. Vivian Blake, who had been poised to immortalize Edward's humiliation online, lowered her phone and stared with wide eyes, murmuring, "I've never seen anything like that," her tone carrying genuine wonder instead of judgment. Even the flight attendants, who had tried and failed with professional detachment, stood near the aisle transfixed, their skepticism replaced by respect for the teenager who had accomplished what none of them could. Edward felt his pride rearrange itself, not in the arrogance of wealth or power but in something humbler, an acknowledgement that greatness was not always where the world expected to find it, and he whispered almost involuntarily, "How did you do it?" Malik looked up briefly, still humming, his eyes calm, and replied softly, "My grandmother taught me this lullaby, sir. And I learned how to help my sister when she had colic. You hold them steady, apply pressure here, keep your movements calm, and sing something they recognize. Babies feel more than they understand. Sometimes the right rhythm speaks louder than words." Edward's throat tightened at the sincerity of Malik's explanation. Realizing this boy had not only knowledge but wisdom, the kind of wisdom born from struggle and love rather than privilege or formal education. He found himself studying Malik closely, noticing the duct-taped patches on his backpack, the notebook peeking out from its side pocket covered with dense calculations and strange symbols that resembled the advanced equations Edward's engineers used at Langston Technologies, and he realized with a jolt that Malik's gift went far beyond calming infants. This was a mind shaped for brilliance. Passengers leaned in, curiosity replacing disdain, and Edward felt compelled to ask, "Who taught you mathematics? Who showed you how to write like that?" Malik, adjusting Isabella gently as she drifted deeper into sleep, answered with quiet honesty, "Mostly myself, sir. My school didn't have much for math. I studied at the library, took online classes, worked on problems at night after helping my mom and grandma with my siblings. I guess numbers just made sense to me the way this does." His words struck Edward with force because he recognized that same language of problem solving, the same framing of obstacles as puzzles to be solved, that had fueled his own rise in business. But in Malik, it carried a purity untouched by ambition, born instead from survival and a determination to make life better for others. The flight attendants finally spoke, one asking in a voice edged with disbelief, "How long do you think she'll stay calm?" And Malik replied with quiet certainty, "If it's what I think, she'll sleep peacefully for the rest of the flight. Her body has relaxed. The pressure is gone." His prediction proved true almost immediately as Isabella's eyes fluttered closed and she surrendered completely to slumber, her tiny chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths that filled Edward with relief so overwhelming he nearly collapsed into his seat. The cabin, once a chamber of judgment, now radiated warmth, passengers nodding in admiration and whispering among themselves, and Edward knew every one of them was silently acknowledging that they had misjudged Malik the moment he stepped forward. For Edward, the moment carried deeper meaning, because he realized he had nearly dismissed Malik too, blinded by exhaustion and prejudice he didn't want to admit lived inside him, and now he sat face to face with the truth that a teenager from one of the most overlooked neighborhoods in America had saved not only his daughter's peace but his dignity. Edward sat motionless, afraid that even a shift in his breathing might break the fragile silence that now blanketed the cabin, but as minutes passed and Isabella remained peaceful in Malik's arms, he allowed his mind to unclench from the torment of the last hours and drift toward curiosity about this boy who had emerged from economy like a figure summoned by fate. Malik sat upright with quiet composure, gently rocking the baby in rhythm with his humming. And Edward's sharp eyes, trained to evaluate potential in boardrooms and negotiations, began to notice the details that revealed more about the teenager than his modest clothes and patched backpack had at first glance. The backpack was indeed worn and fraying at the edges, but stitched across its surface were patches from mathematics competitions, local and regional contests, where Malik's name must have earned recognition, and peeking from the side pocket was a thick notebook, so crammed with dense symbols and equations that Edward, despite his education and vast resources, recognized only fragments. It was not the kind of work a high school student idly scrawled, but the obsessive calculations of a mind that saw numbers as both puzzle and poetry. Edward found himself leaning closer, the way he might when evaluating a promising startup, and asked softly so as not to disturb Isabella, "Those patches, are they from competitions?" Malik glanced down briefly, his expression modest, and replied, "Yes, sir, from math contests in Chicago and Illinois. I competed whenever I could. Sometimes my teachers could get me the entry fees, sometimes my neighbors helped." His voice carried no bragging, only matter-of-fact honesty, but Edward heard in it the echoes of sacrifice and community effort. "And this notebook?" Edward pressed, nodding toward the bulging journal. Malik hesitated, then admitted, "That's just my practice. Problems I've been working on for the International Mathematics Competition in London." At that, Edward felt the floor shift beneath him. This boy was not simply a gifted caretaker of babies. He was a prodigy carrying the weight of a dream bigger than himself, and Edward suddenly realized that Isabella's peace was not the only miracle on this flight. The other miracle was the presence of Malik Johnson himself. He leaned back, astonished, as Malik continued with quiet sincerity, explaining how he had qualified for London by winning the Chicago Regional, then the Illinois State Championship, then the National Qualifier. He spoke about studying late at night at the public library because his home was too crowded and noisy, about teaching himself calculus and combinatorics from borrowed college textbooks, about a math teacher named Mrs. Rodriguez who recognized his raw talent and pushed him far beyond the limits of their underfunded school. Edward listened with growing wonder, imagining the grit required for this boy to leap from the south side of Chicago onto the global stage, and felt humbled by the scale of Malik's determination. Meanwhile, Isabella stirred, shifting slightly against Malik's chest, but rather than crying, she only gave a soft sigh and nestled closer, as if she too sensed the safety of his presence. Edward had to smile at the sight, though it was tinged with an ache he couldn't name, because it was undeniable proof that his daughter had chosen to trust this boy more than she trusted him, her own father. That realization stung but also enlightened him, and he decided to lean into it rather than resist. He asked gently, "How do you balance everything, Malik? School? Family? Competitions?" Malik's eyes softened, his voice steady though filled with truth. "My family comes first. Always. My mom works 2 jobs as a nurse's aide. My grandma looks after my younger siblings. I take care of them when I can, especially my little sister Maya. She had colic, worse than Isabella, so I had no choice but to learn. At night I study. Sometimes I'm exhausted, but I keep going. This competition is more than just mine, sir. My whole block, my church, my neighbors, they all pitched in for this trip. Every bake sale, every car wash, every $5 donation, they all believed I could do this. Edward's throat tightened because he recognized that weight, the pressure of carrying not just personal ambition but the hopes of many. And he knew in that instant that Malik was operating at a level of responsibility far beyond his years. Most teenagers lived for themselves, yet this one carried his family and his community on his back and still walked tall. Passengers nearby who overheard their exchange looked on in awe. Their earlier judgments dissolved into admiration, and Edward realized that Malik had not only won his daughter's trust, but was quietly winning the respect of everyone who had scorned him only moments before. He considered his own journey, how mentors had opened doors for him when he was young, and he felt the stirrings of something he had not expected to feel on this flight. Responsibility not just to his company and his family, but to this extraordinary boy who had crossed into his world. Edward's mind, ever strategic, began to turn over possibilities, thinking of the Whitaker Foundation's education initiatives, imagining what resources could do if poured into Malik's path, but he held back those thoughts for the moment, not wanting to overwhelm the boy who was still balancing his daughter in his arms. Instead, he asked, almost reverently, "Why mathematics, Malik? Why numbers?" Malik's smile was faint but real as he replied, "Because numbers are honest, sir. They don't care where you come from, what color you are, or how much money you have. If you see the pattern, if you find the truth, it works the same for everyone. Math is fair even when life isn't." Those words struck Edward like a revelation, for in them was the distilled essence of something he had long forgotten in his climb to power. The idea that truth and fairness could exist without wealth, without politics, without manipulation. Malik spoke those words with the clarity of someone who had lived injustice and still chosen to seek order in chaos, and Edward felt humbled again, realizing that he was sitting beside a mind and a spirit destined for greatness. Isabella's tiny chest rose and fell in deep, peaceful rhythm. Her hand curled trustingly against Malik, and Edward knew that this boy had not just calmed his daughter, he had reminded him of values. Edward had let slip in the noise of ambition. Edward sat back in his seat, his thoughts racing faster than the engines propelling the plane across the Atlantic, his gaze fixed on Malik, who continued to cradle Isabella with the calm of someone who had already lived a dozen lifetimes of responsibility despite being only 16, and as the billionaire watched this boy's poise and intellect unfold, he felt a stirring inside him that was equal parts gratitude, admiration, and something more difficult to define, a sense that fate had orchestrated this meeting not just to save a screaming baby, but to open Edward's eyes to what truly mattered. The silence in the cabin remained miraculous, a fragile bubble of peace after hours of chaos, and passengers who had moments earlier been full of contempt now watched Malik with quiet respect. Their judgment dissolved into awe, but Edward knew this silence would not last forever, because once the plane landed, his obligations would come crashing back. 5 days of crucial board meetings, high-stakes negotiations, and decisions worth billions of dollars, all while trying to care for his infant daughter without help. He thought about how close he had come to collapse already, how helpless he had felt when Isabella refused every bottle and lullaby, and he knew with startling clarity that he could not endure such helplessness in the middle of a London boardroom. The thought terrified him because his company's future and thousands of jobs depended on his focus, yet Isabella's needs were unrelenting, and Claire was not here to share the burden. As he sat in this clarity, he turned his attention fully to Malik, who looked down at the sleeping baby with tenderness, his humming fading into a quiet stillness. And Edward made a decision he had never imagined making. When he boarded the flight, he would ask this teenager, this brilliant young man from Chicago, to stay by his side in London, not as charity but as necessity, as the one person who had proven capable of giving Isabella peace. He cleared his throat softly, careful not to wake the child, and said in a low but serious voice, "Malik, I want to make you an offer." Malik looked up, cautious but attentive, and Edward continued, For the next 5 days, I have business in London that will determine the future of my company. I cannot bring Isabella into those meetings, and I cannot leave her alone. I'd like to hire you as her caregiver during this trip. I'll pay you $500 a day. I'll provide you with a hotel room adjoining mine, and I'll make sure you have transportation to and from your competition. What you've done here, what you've done for my daughter, is worth far more than money, but this is the least I can offer." The words hung heavy in the air, and Malik's eyes widened with shock. His hands still steady beneath Isabella, but his mind racing. $500 a day was more than his mother made in a week of double shifts, more than his grandmother had ever seen at once, more than most people in his neighborhood could dream of. It was a life-changing sum, even if just for a week, but Malik's expression did not light up with excitement or greed. Instead, his brow furrowed, and he asked quietly, "Sir, why me? You could afford the best nannies in London, people with training and experience. Why ask me, a kid from economy class?" Edward leaned forward, his voice filled with conviction. "Because you've already proven yourself more capable than any professional I could hire. I watched you solve a problem no one else could solve. Not the flight attendants, not me, not anyone. You remained calm under pressure, you acted with compassion, and you succeeded. That's rarer than genius in my world. I don't just want someone to hold my daughter. I want someone who understands what she needs, who cares enough to help her. And clearly that's you." Malik shifted uncomfortably, his mind torn. He thought of his community back in Chicago, the people who had scraped together money through bake sales, car washes, and small donations, so he could come to London for the international mathematics competition. This was his one chance to prove himself on the world stage, to earn the scholarship that would open doors to MIT and beyond, and he knew every hour of focus counted. Accepting Edward's offer could distract him, could jeopardize his preparation, and failure was not an option when so many people had sacrificed for him. He spoke carefully, his voice filled with sincerity. "Mr. Langston, I'm honored, truly, but I need to be ready for this competition. My entire future depends on it. I can't risk losing focus." Edward nodded, respecting the boy's priorities, but pressed gently. "I wouldn't ask you to sacrifice your future. The competition must come first. All I would need is your help during my meetings and in the evenings. You would still have hours free each day to study and prepare. Think of it not as a distraction, but as a partnership. You help me with Isabella, and in return, I'll help make sure you can give your best at the competition." Malik considered the words, and as he did, Edward added something more. Something that came from a place of honesty rather than strategy. "Malik, in my life I've met brilliant people, scientists, entrepreneurs, engineers, but very few have shown both brilliance and character. You could have sat in your seat and ignored us. No one would have blamed you. But you chose to step forward, to risk rejection and suspicion, to help a stranger. That choice tells me everything I need to know about you. Character is rarer than intelligence, and you, Malik, have both." Malik felt overwhelmed, not by the offer of money, but by the sincerity in Edward's words. He remembered countless times when his family had been dismissed or judged because of where they lived or the color of their skin, and he recognized how rare it was to be seen not as a problem, but as a solution. Yet doubt lingered. He had been disappointed before, promised opportunities that never came, praised for his abilities, but never truly supported. "Can I have some time to think about it?" he asked cautiously. Edward nodded, his tone firm yet gentle. "Of course, but let me tell you one more thing. My company has a foundation that provides scholarships and mentorships for gifted students from underserved communities. Regardless of how you perform in the competition, I'd like to discuss how we might support your educational goals. This isn't just about this week, Malik. This could be about your future." The words struck Malik like thunder. Malik sat quietly in the seat beside Edward as the plane began its descent into London, Isabella asleep in his arms, his mind still swirling with the offer he had received only hours before, and though he had not yet given Edward a final answer, he knew his life had already changed, because the billionaire had seen in him not just a teenager from the South Side, but a young man with promise and dignity. When the aircraft landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, Malik carefully handed Isabella back to Edward, and the three of them exited together, drawing curious glances from travelers who wondered why a billionaire was walking side by side with a black teenager in patched clothing. Outside Heathrow, a sleek black Mercedes awaited, a driver in uniform standing stiffly by the door. And when Edward gestured for Malik to enter the car alongside him and Isabella, Malik hesitated, unused to such luxury. But Edward insisted with quiet firmness, and so Malik stepped inside, feeling the leather seats beneath him, as though he had crossed into a different universe. The car sped through London's bustling streets, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement, and Malik pressed his face to the window in awe, seeing buildings and monuments he had only glimpsed in books or on screens, while Edward watched him with a faint smile, reminded of his own first trip abroad decades earlier, when everything had seemed impossibly large and out of reach. At last the car pulled up to the Langham Hotel, its marble facade gleaming under golden lights, doormen in tailored uniforms rushing to open the doors, and Malik froze on the sidewalk, overwhelmed by the opulence of the lobby visible through glass doors, chandeliers sparkling like constellations above marble floors. Edward placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and guided him forward, announcing to the staff that Malik was his guest. But even as they checked in, Malik noticed the suspicious glances from hotel employees who seemed to wonder why a boy dressed in worn sneakers and a second-hand jacket was accompanying a billionaire and his infant daughter. One security guard even stepped toward Malik as if to intercept him, until Edward's sharp voice cut through the lobby, making it clear Malik was welcome. And from that moment no one dared question it again. The suite itself was more extravagant than anything Malik had ever imagined, larger than his entire apartment back home, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Hyde Park, multiple bedrooms, and furniture so ornate it looked as though it belonged in a museum. Edward showed him the adjoining room prepared for him, complete with a massive bed, a marble bathroom, and a view that stretched across the city, and Malik stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to sit or to stand, to touch anything or keep his hands in his pockets, until Edward chuckled and told him, "This is yours for the week. Make yourself at home." As Edward tended to Isabella, preparing a bottle with practiced movements learned under pressure, he began to share pieces of his past, revealing truths Malik had never expected to hear. Edward told him about growing up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a mother who cleaned offices at night, about the scholarship that allowed him to attend the University of Michigan, and about the mentors who believed in him when no one else did, opening doors that changed the course of his life. Malik listened intently, surprised, because he had assumed Edward had always lived in wealth and privilege, but here was proof that even billionaires could rise from humble beginnings, though the scale of Edward's rise seemed almost impossible. "The difference," Edward said, adjusting Isabella in his arms, "is that I had people who saw something in me and gave me a chance. I want to be that person for you." Malik felt both gratitude and unease because offers like that always carried hidden costs. And though Edward's words seemed sincere, Malik's pride warned him not to lean too heavily on the promises of the rich. That night, Malik lay awake in the massive bed of his adjoining suite, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the glass, torn between excitement and doubt. He thought of his mother back home, exhausted from double shifts, of his grandmother's voice urging him to stay humble, and of the faces of neighbors who had handed over crumpled bills to help pay for his plane ticket. They had invested in him not so he could live in luxury, but so he could focus on winning the competition and securing a future. Yet he could not deny the sense of possibility that radiated from Edward's presence, the idea that doors long locked to boys like him might be opening. The next morning, Edward's schedule began in earnest, with a string of meetings from morning until late afternoon, and Malik agreed to watch Isabella during those hours, promising himself that he would still find time to study in between. To his surprise, caring for her did not feel like a burden, but a rhythm that grounded him, her small hands reaching for blocks and toys, her giggles reminding him of Maya back home, and he even found ways to turn playtime into study, by arranging shapes into patterns and whispering equations under his breath as she watched with bright curiosity. When it came time for the opening ceremony of the International Mathematics Competition, Edward ensured that Malik arrived in style, a car waiting to drive him directly to the Royal Institution, where hundreds of prodigies from 60 countries gathered under one roof. Malik walked through the grand hall with his patched backpack on his shoulders, feeling the weight of the contrast between his modest appearance and the tailored suits of other competitors, yet he carried himself with dignity because he knew he belonged. Judges and directors welcomed them, reminding everyone that they were the future of mathematics, that they would face challenges designed to test not just their skill but their creativity and resilience. and Malik felt his nerves spark into determination. When the first round began, an individual test filled with problems that stretched the imagination, Malik's pencil flew across the pages, his mind alive with patterns and strategies, and as the hours slipped by, he lost himself in the same focus that had carried him from the south side to this stage. That evening, back at the Langham, Edward returned from his meetings weary but victorious, and when he asked Malik how the competition had gone, Malik admitted cautiously that he felt strong but humbled by the brilliance of others. Edward leaned forward and told him a story from his first major business presentation, how he too had felt outclassed until he remembered that he had been invited for a reason, and he urged Malik to trust in the same truth. The morning of the second day in London arrived with pale sunlight streaming through the curtains of Malik's suite, and he sat on the edge of the massive bed, reviewing problems from his notebook, while Isabella babbled softly on the playmat nearby, her small fingers reaching for colorful blocks that Malik had arranged in simple sequences. And though he should have felt the crushing pressure of the competition looming ahead, he found himself strangely calm, as if caring for the baby had given him both grounding and focus. Edward entered from his adjoining room, tie perfectly knotted, briefcase in hand, his face set in the mask of a man about to face investors with billions at stake. Yet when he saw Malik gently guiding Isabella's hands over blocks while whispering equations under his breath, his stern expression softened, and he said quietly, "You're teaching her, aren't you?" Malik looked up, a small smile flickering across his face, and replied, "Babies see patterns. Even if they don't understand them, it helps me practice too." Edward chuckled, shaking his head in wonder. And for a fleeting moment, the billionaire seemed less like a titan of industry and more like a father watching a miracle he couldn't explain. As Edward departed for his string of meetings, Malik prepared himself for the second round of the International Mathematics Competition, the team problem-solving event that required 4 students from different countries to collaborate on complex, multidimensional challenges. A sleek car arrived to escort him to the Royal Institution, and as Malik stepped out onto the stone steps, he was struck again by the grandeur of the hall, banners from dozens of nations fluttering above, the buzz of multiple languages filling the air, and he felt the enormity of what he was part of. Inside, he was assigned to a team with students from Japan, Germany, and Brazil, each dressed sharply and carrying equipment that screamed privilege and preparation, and for a moment Malik felt the weight of his patched backpack like a scarlet letter. But he quickly pushed away the insecurity, because he knew ability was not measured by appearance. Their first challenge involved designing an algorithm to optimize traffic flow in a major metropolitan area, and while his teammates launched into abstract equations and theoretical models, Malik spoke up with conviction, describing how he had observed traffic patterns firsthand in Chicago, watching how human behavior, weather, and emergency conditions altered the flow in ways formulas alone couldn't predict. His insights shifted the discussion, bridging the gap between theory and reality, and soon the team was adapting his perspective into their solution. By the time the challenge ended, even Kenji from Japan, who had initially dismissed Malik's input, admitted with respect, "You see things differently, and it makes our answers stronger." Malik's confidence grew with each round, and though his teammates had more formal training, he realized his strength lay in connecting mathematics to life, in seeing the unseen variables that others overlooked. They tackled problems ranging from resource allocation to genetic probability models, and at every turn Malik found himself guiding the team toward more complete solutions, not through dominance but through quiet leadership, the kind that inspired cooperation. Meanwhile, back at the Langham, Edward navigated his negotiations with unshakable focus. But in the back of his mind, he carried the image of Malik leading his peers, and he began to see the boy not just as a caretaker or prodigy, but as someone who embodied the rare qualities of both resilience and vision. When Malik returned that evening, exhausted but exhilarated, he found Edward concluding a video conference with partners in Tokyo, and when Edward asked, "How did it go?" Malik answered modestly, "We did well, sir. Better than I thought. They respected my ideas." Edward smiled, setting aside his laptop, and said, "Of course they did. Respect follows competence and courage, Malik, and you have both." As they shared a quiet dinner with Isabella, playing in her high chair, Edward studied Malik carefully, realizing that the boy's unique ability to weave human experience into abstract theory was something even his top engineers often lacked, and he thought about what such a mind could do if nurtured, mentored, and given the resources to flourish. Later that night, Malik sat at the desk in his suite, reviewing problems for the final individual round. But his thoughts drifted back to his community in Chicago, to the faces of neighbors who had sacrificed for his trip, and he whispered to himself, "Don't let them down." Malik awoke on the final day of the International Mathematics Competition, with his heart pounding, the weight of years of study, sacrifice, and hope pressing down on his chest. And yet when he glanced toward Isabella's crib in the adjoining suite and saw her stirring with a smile rather than a cry, he felt a surge of calm, as though the baby herself was reminding him that he had already conquered the most difficult trial on this journey. Edward entered the room, impeccably dressed for another day of negotiations, and asked, "Are you ready?" And Malik, though nervous, replied with quiet determination, "I've never been more ready." The car ride to the Royal Institution was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of London traffic, and Malik stared out the window, replaying every problem he had solved during practice. Reminding himself of the neighbors who had handed him crumpled bills and the family that had believed in him when the world had not. Edward watched him, recognizing the same intensity he had once carried into his own make-or-break meetings, and he thought again about how much this boy reminded him of himself, though shaped by a harsher environment and a different kind of struggle. At the hall, Malik joined the other competitors, his patched backpack slung over his shoulder among sleek leather cases and designer clothes. But his focus did not waver. The final round was unlike any before. Each competitor was assigned an open-ended problem that required not only mathematical skill but vision, the ability to present a solution to judges who valued creativity and application as much as accuracy. Malik's problem involved modeling the spread of infectious diseases in densely populated urban areas, a challenge that combined epidemiology, statistics, and network theory. And as he read the prompt, his mind leapt immediately to memories of his own neighborhood, where crowded apartments and limited healthcare had turned even minor illnesses into crises. He began scribbling furiously, building equations that accounted for not just theoretical vectors but human behavior, access to care, and the randomness of city life. For 20 minutes the room was silent except for the scratching of pencils and the occasional sigh, but Malik felt transported, immersed in the same flow state he experienced when calming Isabella, solving problems not as puzzles on paper, but as living realities with human consequences. When it came time to present, Malik stepped forward, shoulders squared despite the tremor in his stomach, and spoke clearly about how his model worked, showing not only graphs and calculations but also explaining how the principles could be applied in real communities to prevent suffering. His voice carried conviction, sharpened by the knowledge that he was speaking not from theory but from life. The judges, experienced mathematicians and scientists from universities across the world, leaned forward with interest, exchanging glances that revealed their surprise at the depth of his approach. And when one asked, "Where did you learn to think this way?" Malik answered with simple truth, "I grew up in a place where healthcare was limited and density created unique challenges. I used mathematics to see patterns in the chaos, to find solutions where none seemed to exist. Numbers don't care who you are, they tell the truth if you know how to read them." The hall fell silent, then erupted in applause, not just for the correctness of his solution but for the clarity of his vision. And as Malik stepped down from the stage, he felt the weight of his entire community on his shoulders, knowing he had honored them. That evening, the closing ceremony gathered all competitors in the grand auditorium, flags of every nation displayed. Anticipation thickened the air as the results were announced. Third place went to Klaus Müller from Germany, second place to Park Min-jun from South Korea, and then the pause that stretched for what felt like an eternity before the director declared, "The winner of this year's International Mathematics Competition, representing the United States, Malik Johnson of Chicago, Illinois." The auditorium exploded with applause, cheers echoing from balconies, and Malik stumbled forward in a daze as he accepted the trophy and certificate that guaranteed a full scholarship to MIT. He could barely breathe, his mind flashing with images of his mother crying tears of joy, his grandmother whispering prayers of thanks, his neighbors celebrating in the streets, and above all the knowledge that he had proven himself worthy of their sacrifice. Edward stood in the audience holding Isabella, clapping with genuine pride, and for the first time in years he felt tears sting his eyes, not for business triumphs or personal gain, but for the sheer power of watching a young man seize destiny. Yet even in the glow of victory, temptation appeared, as a rival billionaire named Donovan Pierce approached Malik after the ceremony, offering his hand and a smile that carried both charm and calculation. "Malik," Pierce said smoothly, "you are exactly the kind of mind the future needs. I'll fund your education fully. No conditions, no restrictions, no waiting. Forget foundations and promises, you'll have resources tomorrow." Malik hesitated, stunned by the sudden offer. But before he could answer, Isabella, perched in Edward's arms, clapped her hands and uttered her first word, a soft but clear, "Malik," and the sound carried through the room like a benediction, drawing gasps and laughter from those nearby. Edward's eyes widened in astonishment, his heart pounding as he realized his daughter had spoken her first word, not for him or Claire, but for the boy who had calmed her, nurtured her, and shown her the patience that had changed everything. Malik looked at Isabella, then at Edward, and something inside him settled. A certainty that no rival offer could shake. He smiled, shook Pierce's hand politely and said, "Thank you, sir, but I already have what I need." The ride back to the Langham that night felt surreal for Malik, the weight of the trophy on his lap both grounding and dreamlike, his reflection in the window showing not just a boy from Southside Chicago, but a young man who had stepped into a future brighter than he had ever dared imagine. And as he sat in the plush Mercedes with Edward beside him and Isabella asleep in her car seat, he realized that the victory was not his alone, but belonged to every person who had scraped together dollars for his journey, to every voice that had told him he could be more, to every struggle that had sharpened his resolve. Edward sat quietly, studying Malik with the same careful intensity he once reserved for rising entrepreneurs, and the billionaire's mind, usually filled with figures and forecasts, now turned toward legacy, for in Malik he saw the embodiment of resilience, brilliance, and character. The very traits he hoped his daughter would grow up valuing more than money or power. When they arrived at the hotel, staff greeted Edward with polished deference, but this time their eyes lingered on Malik with respect rather than suspicion, as though Isabella's first word had spread among them like a story they could not forget. Inside the suite, Edward poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider, raising one toward Malik in a toast, saying, "You reminded me what truly matters, and I cannot thank you enough." And Malik, humbled but firm, responded, "You gave me a chance, sir, and believed me when you didn't have to." The exchange carried more than politeness. It carried the weight of a promise, unspoken but understood. Over dinner, while Isabella gurgled happily in her high chair, Edward outlined his vision for the Isabella Foundation, a program dedicated to providing scholarships and mentorships for gifted students from underserved communities, beginning with Malik as its first beneficiary. He explained that wealth meant nothing if it did not open doors for others, and that he wanted his daughter to grow up knowing her name was attached to opportunity, not entitlement. Malik listened, his heart racing with the realization that the chance he had dreamed of for himself could now ripple outward to countless others like him, children hidden in corners of forgotten neighborhoods who only needed a spark to ignite their brilliance. Later that night, after Edward retired with Isabella, Malik stood by the window of his suite, gazing over the lights of London, thinking of his mother, his grandmother, his siblings, and the crowded apartment waiting for him back home, and he whispered into the night, "We made it," knowing that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. The following morning, as they prepared to return to the United States, Malik carried his trophy through the airport with Edward and Isabella at his side, and passengers who had once judged him on the plane now recognized him from news headlines announcing his victory. Their stares no longer skeptical but admiring, and Malik felt a deep satisfaction not in their approval, but in the knowledge that he had stayed true to himself. On the flight back, Edward asked Malik to sit beside him in first class, no curtain dividing their worlds now, and as Isabella slept peacefully between them, Edward spoke about mentors, about the factory worker father and the cleaning lady mother who had raised him, about the professors who had believed in him, and he told Malik that success was never a solitary achievement, but always the product of someone extending a hand. Malik nodded, thinking of his grandmother's lullabies and his community's sacrifices, and he realized the truth of Edward's words, that compassion was the currency of real change. As the plane soared over the Atlantic, Malik wrote in his notebook, not equations this time, but words, sketching out an idea for a program that could teach kids in his neighborhood not only mathematics, but the belief that they belonged on global stages. And he promised himself that when he returned from MIT, he would make that vision real. Edward glanced at the page and smiled, recognizing the same hunger that had once driven him, and felt peace knowing his daughter would grow up seeing in Malik an example of integrity, brilliance, and courage. When the plane landed in Chicago, Malik's family was waiting, tears streaming as they embraced him, while Edward stood nearby holding Isabella, his presence both supportive and respectful, and the two men shared a look that needed no words, a look that said their paths were now intertwined. News cameras captured the moment, but what they could not capture was the quiet vow Malik made to himself that he would never forget where he came from and never stop reaching back to lift others. That night, as he lay in his own bed for the first time in weeks, Malik thought back to the moment on the plane when he had first stood up, trembling with fear yet driven by compassion, and he realized how fragile the chain of events had been: one decision, one act of courage, one crying baby, and how easily it could have gone another way. He understood now that greatness was not measured in wealth, trophies, or even scholarships, but in the willingness to act when someone needed help. Edward, returning to his world of boardrooms and contracts, carried the same lesson with him, for he knew that his billions would mean nothing if he failed to use them to elevate lives like Malik's, and in that understanding he found a new purpose. Isabella, too young to comprehend, had already played her role. For her cries had summoned Malik into their lives, and her first word had sealed the bond that would shape their futures. As their plane lifted once more for Edward's next journey, Malik looked out the window and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not for riches or recognition, but for the reminder that compassion was the seed of transformation. He had come to London as a poor black teenager with a patched backpack and a head full of equations, and he returned as a champion, a scholar, a mentor in the making, and above all as proof that one act of kindness could carry a person farther than anyone dared believe. And Edward, watching Malik's reflection in the glass, understood that his daughter's legacy was already written in this partnership, in the lives they would change together, and he felt a peace that surpassed any business deal he had ever signed. The end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what you thought about the plot. Did any part surprise you or touch you the most? And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's always inspiring to see how far these stories travel.